Igor Belanov celebrates his second goal against Belgium in 1986. Photo, Getty Images. The World Cup travels from Brazil 2014 to Russia 2018. It will be a journey from the game's spiritual home to its mysterious outpost. Like much of the country, Russia's football too is shrouded in intrigue. Currently, the dialogue about Russian football revolves around President Vladimir Putin's coup in winning the hosting rights for the 2018 edition, hooliganism, and oligarchs, most notably Roman Abramovich, funding clubs abroad. There was a time when Soviet football held sway in the world. Established in pre-revolutionary Russia, the game played a complex role in a totalitarian regime. It conformed to the communist of communist clichés, was used as a diplomatic tool, and gave vent to small acts of defiance. The first strains of total football were played in the erstwhile Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. The team rose to Olympic glory in 1956 and won the inaugural edition of the European Championships in 1960 to cap the golden era of Soviet football. The game flourished within, despite being in the clasp of communism. Football and the state in the USSR. The state was all-pervading and football was no exception. Like most other sports, the game's development was rooted in the Red Army schools, military sports programs. They were important to retain the illusion that the state had control over and was responsible for the success. Sport openly became a means of providing pre-military training and achieving a relatively high standard of national fitness and defense, wrote sports historian James Riordan in an essay, Totalitarianism and Sport in Russia. CSKA Moscow, earlier CDK at Sports Club of Central House of the Red Army, the oldest club in the country, established in 1911, was the official team of the Soviet Army. Across the city, Dynamo Moscow emerged as the site of the MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Soviet militia and the Secret Service organization Cheka. A precursor of the KGB. By all accounts, Joseph Stalin wasn't particularly interested in football, not unless it helped the state proclaim superiority. In his 1987 memoirs Trunye Dorogi K. Olympu, translated as Difficult Paths to Olympus in a James Riordan paper published in the journal Soccer. A special note to Stalin ensuring victory, but Robert Edelman, a professor of Russian history and author of books Spartak, Moscow, A History of the People's Team in the Workers' State and Serious Fun, says in an email interview, there is no actual proof of this, Stalin needing an assurance. It was supposed to be true of all sorts of competitions. Having said this, Stalin did not micromanage sport, which was not one of his primary interests. The defeats on the football field were not taken lightly. At the 1952 Olympics, the USSR were drawn to play Yugoslavia in the first round. It was a politically charged match as Stalin and Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito had severed relations in 1948 and Yugoslavia was excluded from the Communist Information Bureau. Both leaders reportedly sent messages to the teams ahead of the clash. Though the first leg ended 5-5, Yugoslavia managed to beat Russia 3-1 in the rematch. Stung by the defeat, Stalin disbanded the CDKA Moscow team, which made up most of the USSR squad. Team coach Boris Arkadyevs, one of the most prominent names in Soviet football, was stripped of his merited Master of Sports of the USSR title. The club did not compete till Stalin's death in 1953. The Soviet Union team lines up for a group photograph in 1970. Photo, Getty Image. Healing touch football had spread high and wide in the Soviet Union by the 1920s. But the government understood how good a public relations exercise it could be when Dynamo Moscow visited the UK in November 1945 on a friendly tour. The British media chased this curious entourage of unsmiling Russians, all dressed in blue coats and carrying identical cases. Legend has it that they speculated that the Russians had smuggled atomic weapons into the country. As it happened, the visitors had brought their own food supplies. Conspiracy theories, however, kept floating as the Russians rarely, if ever, spoke to the press. They came to be known as the Silent Ones. The Dynamo team opened its tour at Chelsea's Stamford Bridge Stadium, in front of 85,000 spectators. After the match ended in a thrilling 3-3 draw, the local fans poured onto the field. and paraded the Russians who had been their allies in the war on the shoulders. Dynamo's fluid movement and tactical play came as a surprise to the British, mainly because Soviet football had flourished in isolation. They did not enter the Football World Cup till 1958 and played the first Olympics only in 1952. The term international friendly means little in today's football, but it was loaded with diplomatic weight in 1955, when 10 years after the bloody end to World War II, the USSR invited West Germany to play a football match. It was to be a friendly prelude to open dialogue with the Federal Republic of Germany, which, in May that year, had joined NATO of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. On the 21st of August 1955, the USSR and West Germany, the reigning world champions, contested on the football field for the first time. As a gesture of goodwill, the Soviet Union had made arrangements for 1,500 fans to travel from Germany. Almost 80,000 people witnessed the spectacle in Moscow and saw the USSR beat West Germany 3-2. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer met the Soviet leadership a month later to discuss more important issues. It eventually resulted in the USSR releasing 10,000 German prisoners of war, as, on the 14th of September 1955, Lev Yashin, in Black Fort's Lothar Emmerich of West Germany during the 1966 semi-final in Liverpool. Photo, Getty Images. People's team at a time when the USSR's football landscape was dominated with teams organized by government agencies. Spartak Moscow was created by a trade union public organization in 1922. They were the People's Team. Spartak was funded and supported by a variety of civilian agencies, says Edelman. The primary fact was that they were the most successful of the civilian clubs, and supporting them was a safe way of asserting fans' dignity in the face of repression. Supporting football, in general, became a quest for momentary freedom. Desperate for distraction after the hardship of the war years, fans flocked to football games in the thousands, passionately supporting the favored teams. One of the most prominent figures of Soviet and Russian football, Nikita Simonyan, wrote in his memoir Football Is Just a Game, 1989, it sometimes seemed that the entire Moscow went to the Dynamo Stadium. Metro cars full to capacity, trolley buses with open doors. The passengers would hang in bunches from the trams. Some adventurous types even managed to hold on to automobiles. When these teams, Dynamo, Spartak or CDK, played, the stadium would roar deafeningly. The support was so strong that you could easily say that the matches were, at least in part, won by the spectators too. Edelman adds, for some, football was an island of honesty in a dishonest world. Love of football was one way for Soviet men to assert and define the masculinity. For others, football's unscripted dramas challenged the predictability of a planned society. Spartak did not just challenge the established hierarchies of the world, they also refused to conform to a structured defensive style of play. They were rebels, they were stylists. Spartak played fluid, quick-passing football and started asserting the technical superiority over the rivals. They won 12 Soviet championships and a record 10 Soviet Cups. But some of their founders, most notably the Starostin brothers Nikolai and Andrei, paid the price for the defiance. In 1942, they were arrested on charges of conspiring to assassinate Stalin and sent to a gulag, a prison labor camp, for 10 years. Nikolai was only released in 1953, and served as the Spartak president from 1955 to 92, total. Football. You might suppose that Soviet football was about a regimented, physical approach. It was quite true in the earlier decades, when teams were stuck in a time warp of ineffective formations and tactics. Even then, though, there were teams like Spartak and Torpedo Moscow, which were fashioned on creative flair. It was, however, the Basque Tour of 1937 that challenged, and eventually forced, the Soviet national team to rethink the football ideology. International exposure was rare back then, and the Basque team's technical superiority stunned the Russians, especially the 4-7 defeat of Dynamo Central Council's Select 11, a careful assortment of the best football talent in the country. After the Basque Tour, all the leading Soviet Teams started to reorganize in the spirit of the new system. Arkadyov, who was then coach of Metalurg Moscow, a Soviet team, now defunct at the time, has been quoted as saying in Jonathan Wilson's book, Inverting the Pyramid 2008. With the third back, lots of hours and foreign clubs employed so-called roaming players in attack when he took over Dynamo Moscow. In 1940, Arkadyov encouraged the creative state, giving players the freedom to roam more and pull teams apart. Soviet football changed from an archaic and somewhat suicidal 2-3-5 formation to a more tactical 4-4-2, first employed by Torpedo Moscow manager Viktor Maslov, whom football historian Wilson calls the progenitor of pressing in his book. Arkadyov, who took over the Soviet national team in 1952, amplified the success of that strategy. We confused the opposition, leaving them without weaponry with our sudden movements, he said. With the transition of the defensive line from a zonal game to marking specific opponents, it became tactically logical to have all the attackers and even the midfielders roaming, while having all the defenders switch to a mobile system. It was an early version of total football, as we now know it. Yashin moves in to save from Portugal's Eusebio during the 1966 third-place match in Liverpool.